What if I told you that the oil your car uses, something as simple as choosing between 0W-20 and 5W-30, can be the difference between an engine that quietly reaches 500,000 miles and one that fails before it ever sees 120,000? That may sound dramatic, but it isn't speculation or marketing hype. In a large-scale durability analysis involving dozens of engines and verified by independent laboratories working alongside major automakers, researchers found that oil choice didn't just affect fuel economy, it directly altered wear rates, oil consumption, valve cleanliness, timing chain stretch, and long-term reliability. And yet, despite this evidence, most drivers and even many mechanics still select oil based on habit, dealership stickers, or what sounds more modern, without understanding what those numbers actually mean. By the end of this breakdown, you'll understand why that decision matters far more than you've been told, how automakers quietly influence oil recommendations, and why the oil that looks best on paper can slowly shorten your engine's lifespan without giving any immediate warning signs. To understand why this happens, you first have to understand what the numbers on the oil bottle really mean, because 0W20 and 5W30 are not arbitrary labels. They describe how oil behaves under temperature extremes. The first number, followed by the letter W for winter, represents how easily the oil flows when cold. 0W oil remains thinner at low temperatures, allowing it to circulate more quickly during cold starts, while a 5W oil is slightly thicker and takes marginally longer to reach critical engine components. The second number describes the oil's viscosity at operating temperature, roughly 212 degrees Fahrenheit. A 20-weight oil becomes relatively thin once hot, while a 30-weight oil maintains a thicker, stronger lubricating film under pressure. On paper, 0W20 appears superior because it improves cold start efficiency and reduces internal drag, but engines do not live on paper. They operate in heat, under load, at high RPM, and often in conditions far harsher than standardized test cycles. To see what happens in the real world, an independent durability study partnered with automotive testing institutions to run a long-term comparison across identical engines under controlled conditions. Half were filled exclusively with 0W20, the other half with 5W30, all maintained on identical service schedules and driven under the same loads. Over time, the results became impossible to ignore. Engines running 0W20 did show slightly better fuel economy, especially in city driving, but they also experienced significantly higher bearing wear, increased oil consumption, and greater timing chain stretch as mileage accumulated. By around 150,000 miles, wear indicators in the 0W20 group were substantially higher, while engines using 5W30 showed cleaner internals, stronger oil film retention under load, and better long-term stability. In simple terms, thinner oil delivered short-term efficiency, but thicker oil delivered long-term survival. Veteran mechanics with decades of experience often summarize it bluntly: 0W20 helps engines survive warranty periods, but 5W30 helps them survive ownership. This naturally raises a question that many drivers never ask. If thicker oil protects better, why do so many modern vehicles, SUVs included, leave the factory with 0W20 printed on the oil cap? The answer has very little to do with engine longevity and everything to do with regulations. Corporate fuel economy standards penalize automakers when fleet-wide efficiency targets are missed, and switching millions of vehicles to thinner oil boosts average fuel economy just enough to avoid massive fines. Automakers have openly acknowledged in technical documentation that low-viscosity oils are specified primarily for efficiency gains, while higher viscosity oils may offer improved durability under heavy load or severe driving. What they rarely emphasize is that long-term durability testing in markets outside North America often uses thicker oils because those markets prioritize longevity over marginal fuel economy improvements. In effect, the same engine may receive different oil recommendations depending on which regulatory system it's sold under. This doesn't mean that 0W20 is inherently bad or unsafe. It performs extremely well in specific conditions. If you live in a cold climate, drive short distances, maintain strict oil change intervals, and operate a modern engine designed with tight internal tolerances, 0W-20 can reduce startup wear and improve efficiency. However, those conditions represent only a narrow slice of real-world driving. In hot climates, during long highway runs, under towing loads, or in engines with higher mileage, the thin oil film of 0W-20 can shear down under heat and pressure. Once that happens, protection drops rapidly, allowing metal-to-metal contact in areas that rely on oil film thickness to survive. Laboratory testing has shown that in turbocharged or high-stress engines, 0W-20 can degrade into an even thinner effective viscosity after relatively short intervals, leaving components vulnerable long before the oil change reminder ever appears. The biggest myth keeping this cycle alive is the idea that thinner oil automatically means better lubrication. While thin oil flows faster, lubrication depends on film strength, not just flow. Boundary lubrication, the microscopic layer separating metal surfaces, relies heavily on viscosity and anti-wear additives. Thinner oils depend more on chemical additives to compensate for reduced film thickness, and those additives deplete faster over time. As a result, once the protective chemistry breaks down, thin oil loses its advantage quickly. In contrast, slightly thicker oil maintains a stronger mechanical buffer even as additives age. This is why many engines that sound smooth and efficient when new begin to grow noisier and consume oil as mileage increases, even when oil changes are performed on schedule. The oil hasn't failed suddenly, it has slowly fallen below the protection threshold the engine needs to stay healthy. And that's where the real danger begins, because the most damaging effects of oil choice don't show up immediately. They accumulate quietly, deep inside the engine, in places you can't see and symptoms you won't notice until it's too late. And to understand that hidden damage, you have to look at what heat, pressure, and modern engine design do to oil once the engine is pushed beyond ideal conditions.
Once an engine moves beyond laboratory conditions and into the real world, heat becomes the deciding factor that exposes the weaknesses of modern low-viscosity oils. Inside every engine are hidden heat zones that operate far beyond the temperatures most drivers imagine. While the coolant gauge may show a comfortable operating range, localized temperatures around piston rings, timing chains, cam lobes, and turbo bearings routinely exceed 260 degrees Fahrenheit, with brief spikes climbing much higher under load. In these zones, oil is no longer just a lubricant, it becomes a structural barrier separating violently moving metal surfaces. Thinner oils, such as 0W-20, are far more vulnerable to thermal shear in these conditions, meaning their viscosity permanently drops as molecular chains break apart. Once that happens, oil pressure may still appear normal, but the protective film strength is reduced, allowing accelerated wear to begin silently. This is why engines can pass emissions tests and feel smooth while internal damage steadily accumulates out of sight. One of the first systems to suffer from inadequate oil film strength is the timing system. Modern engines rely on long timing chains and hydraulically tensioned guides to maintain precise valve timing. These components depend on oil pressure and viscosity to keep chains tight and dampen vibration. When oil thins excessively under heat, timing chains stretch faster, guides wear prematurely, and tensioners struggle to maintain control. Manufacturers rarely connect these failures to oil choice in public statements, yet teardown analyses consistently show that engines run on thin oil for extended intervals exhibit measurably greater chain elongation by 120,000 miles. Once timing drifts, fuel efficiency drops, emissions rise, and in interference engines, catastrophic valve damage becomes a real risk. The tragedy is that none of this is immediately audible or visible to the driver until the damage is already advanced. Oil consumption is another warning sign that thin oils often accelerate rather than prevent. Contrary to popular belief, burning oil is not always the result of worn piston rings alone. When oil lacks sufficient viscosity at operating temperature, it can bypass ring seals more easily, especially in engines with low tension rings designed to reduce friction. Over time, this leads to increased oil consumption, carbon buildup on pistons, and clogged oil control rings that worsen the problem further. Manufacturers may label a quart every 1,000 miles as acceptable, but from a mechanical standpoint, it signals that oil is failing to maintain its sealing role. Thicker oils like 5W-30 resist this migration more effectively, helping rings maintain compression and reducing the formation of carbon deposits that eventually require expensive repairs. Turbocharged engines amplify these risks dramatically. Turbochargers spin at speeds exceeding 150,000 RPM and are lubricated entirely by engine oil. In these systems, oil must withstand extreme heat, shear forces, and rapid circulation without breaking down. Thin oils degrade faster in turbo bearings, leaving behind coke deposits that restrict oil flow and overheat the shaft. This is why turbo failures often occur even when oil change intervals are followed precisely. Engineers inside several automakers have quietly acknowledged that while 0W-20 meets efficiency targets, it operates dangerously close to the minimum protection threshold in turbo applications. As a result, many technicians servicing high-mileage turbo engines privately recommend stepping up to a 5W-30 or even a 0W-30 once the vehicle exits warranty, dramatically extending turbo life without sacrificing reliability. This brings us to the oil grade engineers often prefer when regulations are removed from the equation. In internal testing and long-term fleet evaluations, many manufacturers have found that mid-range viscosities, such as 0W-30, provide an ideal balance between cold start flow and high temperature protection. These oils maintain strong film strength under load, while still flowing